today's webinar on rapid rehousing presented by the Domestic Violence and Technical Assistance Consortium. Today our presenters are Chris Billhart of the National Alliance for Safe Housing, Linda Olson from the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Emily Reamer from Collaborative Solutions. My name is Jenny Herget, and I'm the TA coordinator with Nash, and I'll be helping to moderate the webinar today. We also have Suzanne Marcus from Nash, who's going to be moderating our Q&A at the end of today's session. We will be answering some questions in the chat box, but we definitely encourage everybody to put questions for the Q&A in that chat box for us to follow up with during the last half hour of today's webinar. At the end of the webinar, we'll send out links for an evaluation, and in that evaluation, you'll be able to request a certificate of attendance. We'll also send out a recording of the webinar along with a PDF of the slides and some of the resources that are mentioned today. If you have questions along the way about any of the resources that will be provided or about anything else related to the webinar, please put that into the chat. And with that, I would like to welcome Chris Billhart to kick things off.
Thank you, Jenny, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's going to be chock full of information that we hope you'll find helpful, and we'll also have some time, as Jenny mentioned, at the end to answer some of your questions. So feel free, again, to type them into the chat box as we go along. Let's start, though, with taking some time to acquaint you with today's presenters, and I'm really liking seeing all the introductions you're making in the chat box, so keep that up as well. Thanks. Since I have the mic right now, I'll start by introducing you to my organization, Nash, the National Alliance for Safe Housing. For those of you who may be new to Nash, here's just a little bit about us. We are a project of the District Alliance for Safe Housing, DASH, which is a local innovative safe housing program in Washington, D.C. We've been a national technical assistance and training provider since the fall of 2015, so we're coming up on 3 years in that role. We're so delighted to have wonderful project partners, including the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which Linda will tell you more about, and the District of Columbia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, both of whom just bring amazing things to the work that we do. And we are also part of the Federal Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, otherwise known as the Consortium because it's easier than DVH-TAC. And we'll be telling you a little bit more about that consortium towards the end of today's presentation. So Nash, it looks like our logo didn't make it to the slide, but you can look at that small one in the corner. As we're doing today with this webinar, Nash's mission is to help communities to work towards increasing the availability of safe housing options for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So that we're really working towards helping people nationwide to create the conditions that allow them that allow survivors to avoid homelessness in their attempts to live more safely. And now we'll hear from Linda Olson about WSCADV.
Hi, everybody. I work, of course, at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we are a member organization that was created to really support our membership with visionary work, to engage the public, certainly train and provide TA for our members, and mostly to create that time and space where members can sort through our work, our future vision, and where we all want to go as an agency and as a movement. Back to you. Oh, to Collaborative Solutions. Hi.
Over to Emily.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. You gave me a moment to be off mute, so thank you for that. Well established. Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're glad to have you here. Again, I'm Emily Reamer, and I am with Collaborative Solutions. We are a nonprofit agency that's based in Birmingham, Alabama, but we provide technical assistance across the U.S., and we value our individuals. All individuals have a right to housing, and what we are seeking to do is to meet the needs of those most vulnerable by focusing on supportive housing systems. We want to maximize their capacity and their long-term impact. And so this slide gives you a longer version of that, but what we want you to hear is that
Our goal is to work within communities and human service organizations toward that end. And our next slide tells you a little bit more about that and what it looks like. It looks like direct technical assistance, organizational development, leadership development, advocacy, and our specific areas of focus are the populations living with HIV and AIDS, those that have chronic homelessness, domestic violence survivors, which is what's key to our webinar today, and those living in rural communities. So that's who we are and what we do. And with that, I think I am giving back to Linda. Is that right?
Nope, it's Chris. We're just going to keep everybody guessing today.
on their toes. Keep them on their toes. Yes, Chris, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so with our introductions accomplished, let's dig in. Here's an overview of what we'll be covering today. We're going to make sure that folks have a basic understanding of what a housing first approach is all about, and then spending some time too in looking at how it's been adapted for survivors, particularly the DV housing first model that WSCADV is WSCADV's hallmark. And then we're going to be looking at some of the approaches that are incorporated in housing programs for survivors that can be really effective in helping them, obtain and sustain housing over time, which is a hugely important part, not just the rent assistance pieces, but the supports that we bring in as well and how. We're also going to be looking, because it's a very important model for us all to be aware of and able to apply in our programs, to the rapid rehousing model and how that needs to be modified when we look at making it effective for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. We'll also be spending some time hearing Linda describe the amazing success that WSCADV has had in Washington State in their statewide effort to increase safe housing options for survivors in many different kinds of communities across the state. So I'm looking forward to having Linda check in with you all about that. And it's extremely important in any conversation about homelessness to keep in mind what we're finding out about racial disparities and a huge overrepresentation of communities of color among people experiencing homelessness. We need always to be shaping our services and strategies with this reality in mind. And many of you may be familiar with the study that was done. The report came out in early 2018 by the Center for Social Innovation, their SPARK project, that looked at 6 communities, lots and lots of HMIS records, collected oral histories, and also conducted focus groups in those communities. And they found that more than 78% of the people experiencing homelessness in those 6 communities, and we think that's pretty representational of what's going on around the country, were people of color. And when you compare that rate to the rates of these populations in the general population, you can see it's a huge overrepresentation. Even when you figure in poverty rates, which are higher among some of these communities of color than among the white population, there's still a huge overrepresentation among people experiencing homelessness. So poverty rates alone don't explain the overrepresentation. We need to make recognizing and dismantling systemic racism a huge part of our work. And they also found that domestic violence was identified as a common thread in the lives of many respondents, which is in sync with a lot of the data that we have about the intersection between domestic violence and homelessness. And we also know that there's a huge overrepresentation of people of color in people experiencing domestic violence as well, because of fewer options and discriminations and less opportunity to ameliorate their situation. So it's a huge number of intersections that are all coming together when we look at domestic and sexual violence and homelessness. There's also a brand new study that came out, and we can send you the links to these studies, that was published in Canada, that found that doing a housing first model that was enhanced with anti-racism practices really did improve housing stability for those communities of color. So we want that to kind of be the backdrop of what we're talking about today. So let's move to looking at strategies to impact on homelessness and housing instability for domestic and sexual violence survivors. We know how many arenas of a person's life can be impacted by domestic and sexual violence, and how homelessness compounds and exacerbates those impacts and has those impacts on its own as well for folks not experiencing domestic and sexual violence. We also know that housing stabilization is core to survivors' ability to begin to regain health and well-being. And so there was a study that our program here in Portland, Oregon was part of by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that found that as housing stabilized for survivors over time, there were improvements in all these realms of people's lives. So well-being improved, psychological improvements, and all that were very much linked to the increase in housing stabilization. So it's very, very core. Back to Emily.
Hi, everyone. So thank you, Chris. So what is Housing First? Hopefully by now all of you part of this webinar have heard about it, but we wanted to provide just some grounding about the history and how it came to be. It was initially developed by Sam Sebaris in New York. He was with Pathways there in New York City. The whole bottom line is that it is about prioritizing housing and then supportive or wraparound services, as some folks call them. The shift is moving away from housing ready to housing first. So, you know, we know the history of homeless and social services was the traditional staircase model wherein engagement in services and treatment adherence was required before housing. And we have learned over time that that does not work towards ending homelessness for those that are most vulnerable. And so what we often bear witness to is folks trying to move through those hoops and requirements and oftentimes unreasonable rules that we don't expect of individuals outside of the homeless systems. And all of this would create additional barriers. And so Housing First is a critical innovation to system design. It's a philosophy that guides systems. It helps move programs to be modeled as permanent housing with those wraparound services. It was initially targeted to those with severe mental illness, and it was reliant on both harm reduction and motivational interviewing if those are interventions that folks are also familiar with. Moving on to the next slide, it identifies these 5 components, 5 core components. And there are various Housing First models that have 8 core components or whatnot, but sticking with the initial model developed by Sam Sebaris, it is about that immediate access. So again, not housing ready, but housing first, removing any barriers that we can. It's focused on that consumer or hopefully future tenant and their choice of housing. It's oriented around recovery, meaning harm reduction or, recovery as it pertains to the survivor and safety, or those with mental illness and what that looks like for them. It's very individualized, so what one support for one tenant may look different than the other. And then community integration, so what social supports are needed to help this person in their stability in maintaining housing. It's important to note that active engagement is a part of this. I know when I was working in programs in the past, folks tend to assume that, okay, we've removed the staircase, and so therefore each individual can engage however they want to. And that is true, but it does not mean that the onus is not on those providers engaged with the client or tenant. It requires a real active engagement without coercion. So that is a sticking point, I know, for many programs that you may be aware of. I also want to say at this point, excuse me, that the structure might look different on a local level depending on the population and the resource availability, but there's many key federal partners. USICH is one of them that have provided checklists for programs that can help you guide your implementation of Housing First if you're still working on that. I want to also point out on this next slide, so many of you may be in the midst of completing your NOFA for this year. And so there are 3 key places in 2018 program competition that speaks to Housing First on pages 7, 18, and 34. And here on this slide, you'll see exactly what they're looking for. So it describes how it is one of HUD's 4 policy priorities, which is on page 7. It defines Housing First specifically in terms of prioritizing rapid placement and stabilization in permanent housing. It does not have requirements or preconditions. And that was what I was mentioning earlier around the historical staircase model. So that description on page 18 will speak to that. And then on page 34, it speaks to the DV bonus for permanent housing and rapid rehousing projects, the joint component that folks may be aware of or applying for or have received an award for. All of those projects that are funded through the DV bonus must adopt that Housing First approach, and you can find more information actually in 2 places on page 8 and 34. So I want to use this opportunity now to say that Collaborative Solutions, as part of the consortium, which we will speak to at the end of the presentation, is the HUD technical assistance provider. So we're funded by HUD, and what that means is I'm here to tell you guys some things about the NOFA, but I have to be careful, Collaborative Solutions has to be careful about engaging in very specific community questions or guidance. We are bound by not giving a community an unfair advantage. So please, if you have questions, we invite them. But as we get to Q&A, if we are a little harried around that part, that is why. And my colleagues can certainly, they are not bound by that same stipulation, and they can certainly speak to that. But we wanted to provide, knowing that you guys are in the midst of that, and it is key and critical to your funding, wanted to provide how Housing First is connected to the NOFA. And I believe this is coming back to Linda.
Absolutely. So just looking at the Housing First core principles, a number of years ago when the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation got very interested in this, and they approached the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence after they saw the amazing work that Chris Billhart was doing at Home Free Volunteers of America in Portland, and asked us to dig even deeper and go statewide and to see if this could possibly work for DV survivors. So as I was looking at the things that we often talk about in terms of what people need to be quote unquote ready for permanent housing, safety of course came up. The issue of abuser sabotage was frequently cited. What about those legal issues? Doesn't everybody need to resolve their legal things before they can settle into permanent housing, heal from trauma? And of course, we know there's housing discrimination. Oh, and the drug and alcohol use in terms of responses and self-medicating to the symptoms of trauma that people have. And finally, just the fact that adequate income is a huge issue, often if their resources have been either depleted by that abusive partner or whether they were relying on that abusive partner in terms of actually paying the rent. So all of these were things that were certainly a problem. And as we really dug into this and started our pilot, and there will be more information about the pilot later and the actual data that came bubbling up. But what we found out, since of course we didn't have access as a field to any of the dedicated resources for housing. The initial Housing First options often had a fund for permanent supportive housing. Our local entities here in the state of Washington, City of Seattle, Downtown Emergency Service Center, they happily built facilities for permanent supportive housing and got HUD funding in order to do that. So there was a dedicated source of permanent housing that had been identified. We see that replicated with the veterans and rapid rehousing vouchers just for veterans. And since we didn't have that, one of the first things we needed to do with our pilot agencies was to identify what are the permanent housing options for survivors. And early on, we found just this amazing, exciting thing that I was so tickled with was the idea that many survivors really just want to choose to stay in their home. Sometimes they might leave temporarily if safety is a concern and either come to shelter or go with family or into a hotel voucher situation. But there were many who stayed in their home. We found the first round of the pilot, it was roughly 30%, and then when we said, well, this looks to be a really good option potentially, that went to half, and we're seeing that pretty consistently in terms of survivors who identify housing instability and even potential requests to come to shelter once they have more of a conversation, find that these are the things we would need to be safely housed in our home and in our community. Of course, we know that Housing First vouchers, Section 8 vouchers with services available, any sort of subsidy, TBRAs is always great when that is available. There's often long waiting lists in different communities. Some communities do have set-asides for DV, but it's not necessarily reliable. Permanent supportive housing has been made available to some DV programs around the state. Sometimes it's just a matter of a few units operated by another housing provider. So it's there, but nothing reliable. Rapid rehousing is probably our biggest go-to, and you will hear so much more from Chris later on related to that. And of course, we really talk about flexible engagement because sometimes survivors need less and sometimes they need more. But it's an incredibly important option. So the platform of services, as we think about the housing and what we're trying to do to get people into housing, we start with survivor-driven, trauma-informed mobile advocacy, and we do a lot of work just reminding agencies what they need to be doing related to survivor-driven. What does it mean to be a trauma-informed culture in an agency, and extend that to survivor services, and of course being mobile, getting out from our facilities. Flexible financial assistance was something that we received, continue to receive through the Gates Foundation, which provides programs with that wonderful pot of money that a survivor can identify what it is they feel they need in order to be safely and stably housed, to retain housing. What are the things that would be helpful to them? And they direct that with the support and encouragement of an advocate. And community engagement, much more than just the resources and the landlords, but also that whole idea of how do we help provide that bridge for a survivor, either into returning to a community or establishing a new community. And there are slides that dig into this just a little bit more. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but just really emphasizing, again, the flexibility of this process, that the survivors lead it. And this doesn't mean that we are demanding of them to do a case management plan within the first 5 minutes of our conversation, and that might be pushing it, but it's really acknowledging that survivors might be coming to us in a whole lot of crisis, of pain, of agony, and will often turn to us and say, I don't know what to do. I have no idea. Please tell me what I should do. So there is the time for that advocate to provide space and think about options, and all the while make it clear that while that advocate can be a guiding resource, it's still the survivor that needs to think about what it is they genuinely want to do in their next few steps. The advocates are not just focusing on domestic or sexual violence. The advocates are also looking at all of the different things that survivor is identifying in terms of stabilization and getting to know a community and adapting to different changes for them if they are from a different country and culture. So we offer options, not opinions or mandates. It's strengths-based, considering the unique needs and strengths of each survivor. I've just been tickled with advocates who talk about what a joy it is to be able to ask, what do you need, instead of provide the menu box of these are our services, where can you fit? We really encourage them to meet survivors literally where they are and to accompany them as they navigate support systems. And it's critical with all of this to consider a survivor's culture and community, and that's certainly for the mainstream programs. And when we look at the many incredibly wonderful culturally specific programs that are in our state and around the country, we know that that is central to how they do their advocacy. Just a reminder of what a trauma-informed approach is, and this doesn't mean that advocates are providing trauma treatment. This is related to that relationship and trauma awareness and providing space and understanding and the collective memory of what it means to be traumatized. The emphasis on safety and the awareness of all of those potential triggers, both the physical, tangible triggers, as well as the emotional or cultural or environmental triggers that could be created. And it's so key for us in the course of our relationship that we are rebuilding the control for that survivor, that it is about choice and power sharing, and that is so key in terms of trauma responses and considerations that people have lost so much control and choice over their life. They haven't had choices about the things that have been happening to them. So for that advocate to work with them in a way that restores that is critical. And of course, strengths-based. So now we are back to Chris.
Thanks, Linda. And I am just so happy to dig in a bit more to mobile advocacy. It's one of my favorite things. We've seen it be so effective and so instrumental to really helping survivors, pursue whatever their plan towards safe housing might be. And we want to make really sure that folks know that although mobile advocacy is sometimes described as a new, innovative approach, it's really important to recognize that it's actually been in use for a very long time. It's been a core approach in culturally specific organizations, including domestic and sexual violence, culturally specific programs. And it's also been used by health providers, parent-child interventionists, and lots of other uses. So it's a great model, but it's not new. It's kind of tested and proven, has been around for a long time. It's also the approach, it was the go-to approach in the early days of the domestic and sexual violence movement. And so while it might be a new approach in many present-day domestic and sexual violence programs, it's actually a return to a less role-based, program-centric approach that we began adopting once we got our buildings. So once we had our shelters and offices, people tended to come to us instead of us going out into the community so much as domestic and sexual violence advocates. Mobile advocacy really eliminates a lot of the barriers that might impede survivors from having advocacy contact and having support built in to whatever their plan is or their goals might be. It allows us to interact with survivors more in the context of their lives. We really get a better sense of what they're contending with if we're out there in the world with them. And it tends to make possible a much more authentic and genuine basis of a relationship between the advocate and the survivor. So rather than, I'm sitting behind my desk and you come into my space, we're somewhere in space that you're comfortable in. And so coming less from roles and less from a sense of a hierarchical relationship. Now, we also know that some survivors are really intimidated by the social services world in general. I mean, I want us to circle back for a second to the societal context and emphasize how vital it is to increase, to make it a point to very much look at how to increase access to services and support. Many survivors may not only not know about how to access support and resources, but they may actually actively avoid systems contact. They faced systemic racism, they've been re-traumatized by some of the systems that they've been in connection with, or for other reasons they just haven't found social services providers all that helpful. So meeting them in their homes or in community settings that are identified by them and that are familiar and comfortable for them allows for a very different kind of contact, and it communicates something very unique, that we're approaching them in a very different way than what they've been accustomed to when they've had systems involvement in the past. Linda already mentioned the trauma context, that having a choice about where you meet and what setting that happens in really helps restore power. And choice and agency is very important to trauma recovery. So that's an important aspect of it as well. Then from the agency standpoint, being out in the community more and having those face-to-face relationships really advances advocates and case managers' know-how and savvy about how the systems work and who the right people are to talk to in X, Y, or Z agency. Also helps establish richer partnerships and collaborations because you're out there seeing how those agencies operate and learning a whole lot more about what they're contending with and where you all come together in shared goals and vision and so forth. So it's a wonderful, wonderful, very effective thing. And mobile advocacy can take many forms. Here are just some of them. I also want to invite you all, if you have other ideas, ways that you've been using mobile advocacy in your programs, to type some of them in to the chat box for others to see as examples. But mobile advocacy can really include a lot of different things. Going together, Linda mentioned accompaniment to appointments, going to court together, sometimes to be active and intervene as an advocate if the survivor wants you to do that, but sometimes just to be a support, to be that calming presence across the room as a survivor is navigating through a particular system that might be very stressful. You can also, and we're talking about housing today, be very active in a housing search, be out there in the community looking together and maybe exploring some of the neighborhoods that the survivor has identified as potentially safe for them. You can also be helping with the getting around. Transportation is something as part of the mobile advocacy that some agencies do, or helping somebody learn how to use the public transportation system and getting on a bus together so that participants can get somewhere and get something done, and you can provide the support and guidance by being there together. Of course, we love having bilingual, bicultural advocates or case managers interfacing with folks from those communities. It can be very, very helpful to be there to bridge a language barrier that survivors might face, such as with a landlord, and really being able to get something accomplished in that visit that wouldn't have been possible if the advocate or case manager hadn't been there. Home visits can be part of mobile advocacy. I'm going to talk in a minute about some of the things you might want to consider if you're including home visits as in your mobile advocacy approach. Many survivors feel very comfortable in their home base, and it can be a great tool to use or approach to use as part of your mobile advocacy, but it's very much something that you talk over with the survivor ahead of time. And I'll talk some more about some of the tools that you might be able to access, that you can access to find out more about that. It can also be not necessarily in a home, but at a coffee shop near where the survivor lives, going to the survivor's workplace because they don't have a long enough break to be able to go somewhere during work, and that might be the only way that they can safely see you. So going to their workplace and meeting with them there. whatever might be good for survivors. Libraries, parks, McDonald's are popular because they usually have a playroom for children. And so just really working together to identify what's safe and comfortable for the survivor. And then taking the logistical burden on ourselves so that we're figuring out how we're going to get there instead of the survivor having to do that, as well as not requiring the survivor to get bus fare or have a working car and any of that kind of stuff. So breaking barriers in many, many ways. Mobile advocacy can also take the form of being co-located in other community settings. So advocates leaving their office to go sit in a health clinic a couple times a week so that they can be available to survivors who come in for appointments and are identified by health providers. So there are lots of different formats that it can take. And if you've got other examples of how you're using mobile advocacy, again, we hope that you type them in. Okay, so considering home visit as a part of mobile advocacy, let's look at some of the things to think about and discuss with the survivor and to do ahead of time if home visiting will be part of the way you provide advocacy or case management with a particular survivor. And this isn't an all-inclusive list. I do want to let you all know that there is a recorded webinar that we provided recently that digs into a lot of detail on mobile advocacy and home visiting. So we can make sure that you have the link to that webinar if you really want to dig in and learn more. But you always want to make sure that this is the survivor's choice, that you don't just announce, I'm going to show up at your apartment next Friday. It's something you offer and that you talk over as a possibility and see whether the survivor is interested in that and chooses to have that be part of the way you maintain contact. You always want to clearly articulate what the purpose of the visit is, that it's not a home inspection. It's a way for you to, maintain contact and make it easy for the survivor to be able to get the support that you can bring. Linda referred to this earlier. You want to make sure that you're educating yourself about any cultural considerations that you'll need to take in mind around home visits. So in some cases it might be, a very difficult thing to arrange because of some of the cultural expectations about who can be in the room with a woman not accompanied by a man. For example, if you're dealing with a Muslim survivor, that might be something to think about. So taking it upon yourself to think about what those cultural considerations might be and educate yourself about them and discuss them with the survivor so that you're not imposing anything that is just not going to work for a survivor. Thinking about the time of day that it might be most convenient for the survivor. Bedtime or kids' meal times may not be a good time, or it might be a good time if you can interact with the family at that time and have a friendly conversation and maintain that supportive kind of role with folks. Who else might be at home? Thinking about whether privacy can be arranged. Is there a housemate? Is it shared housing? Or is it going to be difficult for the kids not to be engaged with the adult conversation? So thinking about how privacy can be arranged. And then making sure that you have to look at your scheduling of home visits because they do take a longer time than having somebody come to you. So making sure that you build in time to find the place and not arrive stressed so that you don't bring that into the home visit. So if mobile advocacy is new to your program, there's necessary cultural shift in addition to implementing the infrastructure and the staff supports and the schedule adjustments and all that kind of thing. And I think one of the most pressing concerns for many programs who are considering mobile advocacy is advocate safety. And I think that means we have to kind of step back from how we conceive of safety. Because despite the very early days of domestic and sexual violence advocates in our early days of the movement, really using a much more community-based kind of kitchen table approach We moved as a system into the direction of helping survivors by helping them hide out in secret locations. And I'm not in any way minimizing or downplaying the need for that for some survivors, at least for a period of time. But we do need to challenge ourselves and consider whether we see safety too narrowly. The fact is that most of the time, survivors live out in the world. They may be temporarily in a confidential location for safety. But most of the time, they're living their lives out in the world, and we have to help them plan for their safety and be in that with them. Safety planning is a huge part, obviously, of working with survivors in the community for the advocates' safety as well as the survivors' safety. So lots of safety planning. We're great safety planners. It's taking those skills and applying them to a different way of having contact with survivors. And there are examples of safety protocols, particularly for home visiting, that you can find through the safehousingpartnerships.org and through WSCADV's wonderful website, DV Housing First page. And so you can find all those things on the web, and we can help you with the links to those. Now it's back to Linda.
All right. So, yeah, it looks like I'm back on with flexible financial assistance, that other key component for DV Housing First. And, of course, it's critical for just about any program you might be operating to know that there's completely flexible dollars that could help survivors move in a direction that would be helpful for them. So this is totally unrestricted funds that in this context used to support survivors become stably housed, remove barriers, and help with retention, different issues related to retention. We've used this money, and of course with a private foundation or with community donors. We've got a number of organizations that, in order to keep their flexible financial assistance pot growing and totally flexible, they have used it in their community appeals as part of their organizing efforts to ask donors to consider this sort of funding support. So being able to have flexibility for housing, employment, survivor safety, and a whole host of other critical needs is really critical. And you know what we often say, because we get into a space of scarcity, especially if we don't really have much of a pot, but it's so important to really determine the need and the amount in full partnership with the survivor. And of course, sometimes this is reality checking, like one program that got the request from a survivor for a car because they had just bought a car for another survivor. And they were able to sit with that survivor and say, well, you don't have a driver's license, and because of your substance abuse past, you're probably not going to get one soon. How about a bicycle that will help you get around this small rural community a little bit more easily and more quickly? And she ended up being thrilled with that. So, you know, just thinking about that, the reflection back and forth, and always being open to additional assistance based on the changing needs of a survivor. Oftentimes our agencies would do a very light touch, remove some barriers, and everybody seemed to be happy, and then life would happen, and maybe 6 months later a critical child support check didn't come through, and that survivor needed additional help. So being open to that. And of course it's voluntary in terms of whatever services, and we're not tying flexible financial assistance to meet certain goals or participate in services. And this is just a list of examples of how flexible financial assistance has been used. There have been many creative ways. I think Suzanne would smile because there was the tattoo removal story that they had at Dash, and we've got a similar tattoo removal story that made the whole difference in terms of employment. One of the things that has received a little bit of funder critique has been support for kids. trying to figure out how does that relate directly to housing. And what we heard time and time again from survivors, that it made the difference in terms of a child's happiness if they could have that birthday party or get their school pictures or be a part of a normal sort of community. And that made it easier for survivors to pursue employment, to know that their child was happy. It made the whole household better and more stable. And community engagement is that final sliver. We started out with landlord engagement and decided that, no, this is much, much bigger than landlords. This really involves advocates working in the community actively and supporting a survivor as they either re-enter their community, stay in the community, or find a new community. It's a part of that social network. So we go beyond resources and systems work and community education to say, this is about helping that survivor identify the pieces of social network, recreate, and work on their relationships so that they have that network around them as the advocate eases out of their life. And of course, with smaller agencies and rural programs and culturally specific programs, this is not news at all in terms of who's in that community. And we started looking very closely in terms of safety for survivors and for advocates as we realize in very, very small communities, chances are the person doing harm, that abusive ex, is still in the picture. The family members, the friends might still be in the picture. So how can we work with that survivor? And what we've been doing in Washington State is just really embracing Jill Davies and Eleanor Lyon's work with their domestic advocacy too, and doing the work internally as well as with and for survivors on safer versus safety, and acknowledging the fact that communities are what they are, and we hear so much. I heard so much from our tribal programs in particular that with the impacts, the historical trauma, the request was, please don't separate our community. Our community needs to heal together. Help us work with you in terms of safety for the survivor and accountability for the person doing harm. So a huge piece for community engagement. A part of it is developing all of those relationships. I think I've said enough about this, so I'll keep moving on that. The restoring connection, how vital it is for a survivor to heal from trauma and for children to build resiliency when they are in that community that supports them and that they're also contributing to. And it truly is vital for safety. The housing advocacy landlord work is a critical component, and just the reminder that landlords are a part of that community. We found that many of our programs didn't necessarily go after the bigger management companies or the housing sorts of clusters, and went after the mom and pop landlords, the people that they might find in their own individual communities, whether they're faith communities or whether they're in their neighborhood, and realizing that there are a lot of folks out there that rent out units, and being able to connect and truly being able to honor the protection, the desire to protect assets, and to work with those landlords in a way that survivors could be welcomed. We certainly found that in our culturally specific community partners where those agencies knew so many landlords within their community and worked with them on both improving what the housing looked like, bringing it up to standard and code with their flexible financial assistance, as well as just doing that advocacy. So all of the array that's listed here, besides accompaniment, besides rental assistance, but also helping them negotiate some of those agreements and build the relationships in their community, including their landlords. And it's back to Chris.
And now it's on to rapid rehousing, looking at some more specifics around this particular approach. So making sure that everybody knows what rapid rehousing is. I think probably it's been around long enough that you've heard the phrase and you may be very familiar with it. It really came into vogue during the Great Recession of 2008 when many people were falling into homelessness because of the economic downturn, and some money was appropriated by the feds to address, rent assistance and getting people housed as quickly as possible so that the homeless population didn't burgeon even further. And that gave us a chance to see that, hey, this works. So many of the folks that were approached with a rapid rehousing model really did quickly exit homelessness and got back into permanent housing in a pretty short period of time, and so avoided long stays in shelters and the need for or entering into chronic homelessness. So it's an intervention designed to do that, to help people quickly leave a homelessness kind of situation and return to housing as quickly as possible. And it's got some of the same hallmarks that Housing First has. Assistance is offered without preconditions, and it also definitely tags in the piece about resources and services that are provided to help sustain housing, and that those should be tailored to the unique needs of the household. So again, is this a good idea for domestic violence survivors and sexual assault survivors? We know that there's actually a range or a continuum of need, and there should be a continuum of housing responses. So some survivors continue to need and want confidentially located shelter, at least for a period of time. Some may face really high barriers to being able to hold a lease and find, a landlord that will accept them given whatever their rental history or economic situation is. And they may need longer-term subsidy or a master lease kind of situation. Others want to, as Linda was talking about earlier, return to the house or the housing that they were living in when it was interrupted by potentially having to flee abuse, at least for a period. They want to return to that home, or they want to remain in that home once the abuser vacates, or maybe sometimes even when the abuser has not vacated. So looking at, particularly with today's housing crisis, whether we can sustain people in their current housing is a huge focus that we should be absorbing into the way we look at this continuum. But many survivors do want to establish themselves and their children as quickly as they can in a neighborhood setting and feel like they have a home again. So rapid rehousing may be a good fit. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but there are survivors that this is a very good model for. So looking beyond the definition and what it aspires to do, let's look for a minute at how rapid rehousing gets operationalized. The National Alliance to End Homelessness has developed this framework, and we like our core components. There are 3 core components for mainstream rapid rehousing. The first being identifying housing, recruiting landlords, getting place in mind for somebody that you're trying to house, addressing the barriers that they might face to being able to secure the unit, and helping them lease up. The second core component is rent and move-in assistance, so financial assistance, being able to pay someone's rent for a while, helping with move-in costs, that can really give a lot of households that boost that they need that otherwise might be insurmountable, especially with the funds that you are increasingly having to come up with to move into a new unit. That is typically in mainstream rapid rehousing then 6 months or less. We're going to talk about that some in terms of how it fits for survivors. And then the third component, core component, is case management or support services. So making those supports and resources available to help people really stabilize in the housing. So as all of you know, using this approach with survivors requires awareness of some of the particular challenges that they and the people trying to help them will be facing in each of these core components. So starting with housing identification, here's some of what we can guess might come along with a survivor that you're trying to get housed. Landlords may smell trouble when if they're aware that domestic violence is part of somebody's history. They anticipate police presence and noise and damage to the unit. So there's definitely some attention that needs to be paid to that aspect of things when you're trying to recruit landlords to work with you on a program that might be serving survivors. Survivors often have that poor housing record, a bad credit that comes along with much of the economic abuse that they experience in a domestic violence relationship. So that's a particular challenge. Survivors may have pets, and a lot of people may have pets, but survivors are often aware that when they leave, they need to take their pets with them, or the pets could be harmed or even killed if they're left in the home with the abuser. So that might be a non-negotiable for many survivors as they're looking to get rehoused. We also know how much trauma survivors have experienced, and that moving into much of the affordable housing in many of our communities is in high crime areas, and that may trigger the trauma that survivors have experienced through their domestic violence experience. And some locations are really kind of off the table because it's a bad idea because of the abuser's proximity. So that you may have a particular unit in mind for somebody, and the location of that just might not work very well. So the general standard for rental subsidy period, and we hear a range of periods of time that different communities have established, is 6 months or less. Some communities, we've heard, have expectations the subsidy will be even shorter than that, like along the lines of 1 to 3 months. So here are some of the problems with that survivors might face. The impact of economic abuse I referred to, and they've had a historic lack of control over their finances. So getting out from under the impact of that can take some considerable work. We know that the difference between somebody who's poor and housed and somebody who's poor and then experiencing homelessness, one of the key factors is social supports. And domestic violence often just really wreaks havoc on relationships and connections to those social supports and resources. It's typically a very isolating experience. So those social supports might not be in place in a survivor's life at the beginning of the time that you're working with them. Employment has often been sabotaged, so the employment record may be very spotty and suspect to a prospective landlord. There also might be an ongoing aftermath of systems involvement, which could make it very difficult for survivors to present themselves at job interviews and work on the income development part of taking over the payment for the apartment or the housing unit. So that systems involvement may mean they have to show up for appointments, they may need to show up for court hearings. It can make it very, very difficult to sustain a new job when those kinds of things are continuing to be part of what they have to contend with. And then trauma impacts as well may really hamper their ability to get out there and develop income right away. So when we look at the third core component, the expectation here is that either directly or through partnerships, rapid rehousing providers will be able to offer participants connections to the services that they identify as important to their housing retention. So these are just some of the survivor-specific needs around support services. And not just these services, I should mention, but these services offered with a domestic violence lens or an ability to provide that context to how the services look. For example, offering financial empowerment services without attention to the economic abuse and its impact on a survivor's financial status isn't going to get you as far as if you've got that DV context in the way that you provide those services. So these are some of the services that domestic and sexual violence programs are working to provide for survivors housed in the mainstream homeless housing system, and really important to have connections to those resources in your community. So because of all of these survivor-specific considerations, we're urging both homeless housing providers and the domestic and sexual violence providers to modify usual services in their rapid rehousing programs when working with survivor households. So here are just some of them. If I needed to put this slide into just one word, it would be flexibility, because flexibility is really key to a lot of the ways we might enact programs so that they're effective with survivors. Flexibility about the housing location, helping the survivor determine what's going to be a safe area for them to be living in, and that could be back in their community because of the social or cultural supports that are there, or it could be identifying a place where they like the school for their child, or whatever the case may be. So having the survivor lead that safety planning in the housing location, and it can sometimes get in the way of the fact that you have an open unit, but it's in a place of town where it's really not going to work for the survivor. Flexible length of rental subsidy is very important. It's very difficult when you look at that whole list of things that survivors might be contending with as far as debt and employment history and so forth to sustain themselves and pay their own rent in a short period of time. So being flexible about that is important. Making sure that you're able to talk with landlords about the impacts of domestic violence, and that all, of course, has to be done in the context of confidentiality for the survivor, but in just general cultivation of landlords and talking with them about how domestic and sexual violence can interact with a rental history and how they can be a huge part of helping somebody get safe and sustain that safety for themselves and their children. Informed consent is really important around any sharing of personally identifying information. Preparing survivors to be ready to talk about, to the extent that they can share or want to share, the impact of domestic and sexual violence on their credit and their housing history. So that you don't necessarily have to be the one to be the spokesperson for the survivor, but helping them prepare for how they're going to answer questions about employment gaps and, damage to apartment units that a prospective landlord might be able to see, so that they can put it in context and describe what they've experienced as victimization rather than their own choices. Being prepared to rehouse somebody a second time if safety becomes compromised. So you might get somebody all settled in and the abuser discovers the location and it's no longer a safe place. So being able to help, find another place to live might be part of working with a survivor over the long haul. We've talked about trauma-informed, survivor-driven services, partnerships, and then knowing the federal, state, and local laws that protect survivors is a key part of working with them effectively. And on that note, just a couple of slides here so that you'll have them about the federal protections that are available through the Violence Against Women Act of 2013. It applies to survivors, domestic and sexual violence survivors, dating violence and stalking survivors, and regardless of sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. It also applies to affiliated individuals of the survivors, so immediate family, household members, etc. And VAWA covers many funding streams that come through HUD, including those that typically flow through the COC. So these are some of the rights and protections that survivors have. And you can see those for yourself on these slides. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about it, but I do want to let you know that we are going to be having a deep dive soon about VAWA protections. So you can come and get lots of questions answered there. We can also turn you on to some materials that we have on the Safe Housing Partnerships website. So it's really important to acquaint yourself with these protections. There are also often state and local housing protections that apply to survivors. So real important to know about those as well for your own community. And then, as Linda said, we've got many, many culturally specific organizations that are working on providing housing for survivors. And they are very well versed in some of the considerations that we need to keep in mind. For mainstream programs, these are additional considerations that you really should be keeping front and center when you're working with survivors from traditionally marginalized communities. These require that providers get the necessary training and have sensitivity to marginalized populations in your communities. It sometimes also requires a lot of creativity, and it also always requires listening to what survivors need and want for themselves. So when you're thinking about what's going to be safe housing, just as an example, you may think in your way of looking at things that moving all the way across town and maybe the next community over will provide some geographic distance and some safety from the abuser. But the survivor may really want to stay in the community where they have those social and cultural supports. So you always have to be listening to what they want, what's going to keep them safe in their own definition of safety, and balance that with, you know, all the considerations that have to go into housing location. So I'm noticing the time, and I am going to flee the scene and turn it over to Linda.
Thanks. All right. So I know that our time is running out, and there's lots of great questions. I know the following material will be part of this slideshow that everyone will have access to. This information is also on the WSCADV webpage, so you can see the evaluation results. But pretty much our first 5 years of our Housing First pilot project was so successful that the Gates Foundation did do another investment in terms of a 5-year demonstration and research project. The first pilot project, the evaluation on these agencies, and the project was done by Dr. Neil Laney, who was at the University of Washington at that time. And we spent a very intensive effort in bringing agencies into this project that serve marginalized populations and urban populations. Really quickly, there were 681 in the 3-year second phase of people who entered. And this is where we were so stunned that 50% were in housing, permanent housing, for 43% renting, 7% owning their own home, and really wanted to stay there. In terms of our follow-up, 3 years later, because it was advocates doing the call, because people didn't necessarily want to engage in a full interview, we had 438 respondents who actually talked to an advocate for the hour and a half that was required. So this is the data that the rest of the results reflects. And at that point in time, 88% were in housing. 7% had been in housing and lost that housing, and we've got some really informative stories of what happened there, because these were, of course, people who did the full interview, and 5% still working on it. This is just a little bit of the ethnicity, immigrant status. The middle lines are the racial makeup, the top, Hispanic or Latina. Latinx is separate from that, as is immigrant refugee at the bottom. And just want to really highlight that because we have 3 tribal programs participating, 35% of our total, our 681 households, were Native American, Alaska Native.
These are just the highlights of the survivors living in urban communities, what that looked like. A similar highlight, again, for you to go back to if you're interested, of the survivors living in rural communities. One of the big differences we heard from them is that in urban communities there was the lack of affordable housing. Our rural folks basically said it was a lack of housing, period. There just wasn't any. The key findings from the pilot project, and this is information that came out of survivor interviews or focus groups, as well as advocate focus groups, and then finally a survivor survey that was provided in several different languages to survivors when they came in for focus groups or potentially to the agency for services. And just highlighting what they observed, what we heard from them was that independence, their sense of autonomy, of control over their choices and decisions, and being able to have real options, all of that led to safety. It made a difference. We certainly heard from them that having the stability and the wonderful work of the advocates made a difference in their health and well-being, and in particular restored their dignity and their self-worth. And the three final bullet points here that we just so have appreciated with the great feedback from survivors is that the safety and stability contributed to a nurturing environment for children. And it was this singular bullet point that so inspired the Gates Foundation about this particular project to say, we really want to learn more. We really want to spend some time in the next round to see again how this supports the resiliency of families and the kids. This was just highly praised for a culturally responsive sort of support and services, that it was flexible enough that any community, any entity, any culture could really take this and feel like this was something they could tailor for the needs of their survivors. And the community engagement piece that I've spent so much time on, the whole enhancement of collaboration and sustainability of housing. That's a huge question for us in our rapid rehousing programs now that many of our DV agencies are doing in the state. And the sustainability of that housing, that rapid rehousing placement, lies back in that community support, engagement, and having ready access to resources and neighbors. Finally, with the demonstration project, Dr. Chris Sullivan is working with us on that. We've got another round of agencies to implement, demonstrate. The idea is our outcomes will show that this improves the health and well-being for survivors. This will be a longitudinal study over time that will help us with that information, as well as with housing stability, and that system will better meet the needs of survivors. And of course, we want that increased level of evidence that can document the great work advocates do and the advantages of flexible financial assistance. This is a description of that evaluation that they are well underway with in terms of recruiting the sample size of 320 survivors. And we're also doing a bit of an evaluation with the flexible financial assistance with all 8 of our Washington state agencies. So far, that is looking really good. I'll just let you see the results on the slide. And of course, remind people that this is not longitudinal. It basically says what happened to these families as they were receiving money. 95% so far, at least at that point, remained or became stably housed. And these were the sorts of things that happened, the activities, and you can see 58% stayed in their own home. So we're excited about the potential of finding out the results in the next few years of the longer-term health, well-being, and especially child resiliency. We're looking forward to adding to the field of evidence. So I'm done. On to questions, and whoever is facilitating that.
I am exhausted taking all of these amazing questions that have been going on in the chat box, and I hope that I've grabbed all of them, and if I missed somebody's question, please send us an email and we can follow up. But thank you, everyone, for your active engagement, and thank you, Linda, Chris, and Emily, for such a great presentation. So first, just for folks who had questions about the HUD NOFA and specifically the DV bonus project, to all those questions, please stay tuned. The DVH Tech TA team will be developing and offering a host of resources around this. And so we won't answer any questions specifically about that, but we will be providing a lot of resources. So please stay tuned. We'll be sending emails. Well, we have your email if you participated today, and so we'll be sharing information very soon about the tools and resources we'll be providing the field on how to navigate the NOFA and take advantage of some of those great opportunities. So the first set of questions are around landlord engagement and helping survivors identify housing and navigating the barriers. The first question was from Leah, and she asked, how can advocates address those barriers, including landlords refusing to work with survivors? And specifically, she talked about how the folks in that the landlords are refusing to work with people who don't have any income, and wondering if anybody wanted to field that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in real quickly in terms of what we found, and it goes back to the relationships and the reliability and steadfastness of the organization that is doing the work with the survivors, that if they step forward and said, we are committed to a subsidy for rental assistance for the next, say, 6 months or 3 months or however long that might be, and they've got that relationship with the landlord, and the landlord is aware that that agency is going to be working with the survivor related to income and employment, that has made a big difference. It goes back to it's all about the relationships in your community.
So for clarification, specifically, Leah was talking about how she's finding that the coordinated entry, or the folks that are providing the rapid rehousing through their COC, are specifying that they won't work with their clients if they don't have an income. Does anybody have any advice around that particular challenge?
Wow, well that kind of flies in the face of what Housing First approaches are all about.
Yeah, sure.
So I think there's some intense conversation that needs to happen, and one thing that could be helpful is contacting the HUD field office in your area and trying to get some more information from them about what the standards are around that. You know, and I think, you know, that closes so many people, not just survivors, but so many people out of the opportunity to make rapid rehousing work for them. So not only is that, you know, kind of not in accordance with what HUD wants to see and with what the model is all about, but it's really not opening access to a whole lot of folks. It sounds like an example of a COC that really needs to have some deep conversation about the realities that programs are facing. I don't know what's happening to the folks that are not being considered for rapid rehousing, if they're just being turned away entirely or if there's some other assistance that they're being offered, but that sounds like a huge gap and something very problematic, and I'm welcome Linda or Emily to weigh in as well.
I would just say I'd down if that were in my community.
You would what in your community?
I would be jumping up and down, and I would be in somebody's face. Anyway, sorry, that's my approach.
That's your approach.
And I think what I would add to all of those answers that were just provided is, connecting with any jurisdiction. So, I don't know, in some cities that means, a neighborhood block council, or it might mean an alderman or a mayor or governor, or really focusing in on the investment and buy-in from folks around what they see their role, if any, in working together towards ending homelessness and what may be required. So some real targeted relationships that we may not always think about. They're not in our purview of service care, but certainly hold some responsibility.
And I would add that a lot of the webinar participants have made it clear and that COCs must serve and can't deny people on the basis of lack of income for rapid rehousing resources. So this sounds like a real opportunity for advocacy and education too. So thanks everybody for chiming in.
Or jumping up and down, as Linda said.
Yes. So another question about helping survivors access and get housing is the challenge around lack of documentation. Social Security card, identity cards is a major barrier. And wondered if anybody had any strategies for overcoming this barrier. Someone mentioned, one of the participants mentioned that they pay for identification cards for clients and assist them in that way, but wanted to see if any of our presenters had thoughts around this.
Well, we haven't mentioned mom and pop yet, so we should put that out there, that sometimes working with the landlords that have just a small number of units and are much closer to the heart of providing housing for folks as opposed to a big rental company or apartment block, that's often where you can find access, and more of an opening in their mindset about who they are willing to rent to. And so I think finding out who some of those smaller landlords are, they don't necessarily have to be small personally, but the smaller businesses who really might be much more approachable than a large company might be, that is often the place to get in the door for some of the folks that are particularly hard to get considered by landlords.
And we found that sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Linda.
We found that in the range, which includes those folks who are undocumented, that working with much smaller landlords, mom and pops, whether we're looking at the urgent need for immediate identification all the way to documentation in general, really makes a difference when you've got those relationships and know your community well and the people in it well.
And there's some great stuff too. There's some great stuff coming through in the chat box. Sadie is talking about good tenancy workshops, so working with survivors around what it means to be a good tenant. And I think really becoming a salesperson for your organization in terms of, landlords deal with tenants that in their mind create issues all the time. If they're working with your tenants, they have wraparound services to lean on, and so really setting yourselves apart as being an additional resource. And I'm going to put a link in the chat box right now. Came up in another webinar and it seemed to be helpful. This wouldn't be for anyone in terms of a citizen lacking documentation, but folks, especially with what's going on in the country now, that may not know what to do because they're undocumented. This is the National Immigrant Justice Center, and they have a litany of resources that may be helpful to some of you as well.
Yeah, thank you. And also, thanks, Emily, for pointing folks to the chat box, because there's a lot of folks providing some great examples and resources. And another idea that I saw in the chat box was doing landlord trainings, which can be really helpful. And this next question, I think connects back to, Chris, what you were saying, but about how do you provide incentives to landlords or for landlords, especially when they don't have any problem renting to folks who have solid rental history. So I think it speaks to what you were saying, Chris, about building the relationship, but with mom and pop landlords in particular. But anything else you'd want to add, Chris, Linda, anybody?
Mm-hmm. I see a note in the chat box about doing community presentations for landlords, and I think that if you can find ways to go to the meetings that landlords attend and bring some DV 101 information to them, that's one way to do it. You can also do that one-on-one, so that you're making sure that they have an understanding that poor rental history is often because of the impact of domestic violence. It's not because of the person themselves not being a responsible tenant. And talking about how survivors want nothing more than to live safely themselves and their children, so that they have lots of incentive to be good tenants. There's also the other direction you can take, like having some funds that you can use to defray landlords' costs if the tenant ends up leaving the unit unexpectedly, or if there is damage to the unit. So having flexible funds that you can help the landlord, and maybe even bring the apartment unit up to code if it's just not habitable, but otherwise could be available to somebody to live in. So there are lots of ways that you can engage with landlords and about tenancy issues that can be helpful. Some with heartstrings, some with dollars, and some with education, I think.
Mm-hmm. And a final incentive that I know, well, maybe not final, but one organization actually did a landlord award. And so for their community, put on a big reception where they had a couple of landlords that got fancy awards and acknowledgement in the local newspaper for being great community members, and supporting all of the people in the community, including survivors of domestic violence. And this was a very, very small community, mm-hmm. but it was quite an event.
Mm-hmm. That sounds great. I love that. And I would just add one thing. With Dash, a program in Washington, D.C., use flexible funding, often to help with eviction prevention and other such things. And we started seeing more and more referrals by landlords for folks in their community, in their housing, that they noticed were needing financial support and assistance. So we began developing relationships with landlords. We didn't even plan on it, but they had so appreciated the fact that we had this flexible funding and could rapidly respond to issues when somebody was falling behind in rent. So we were able to really build on that relationship. But that takes time and resources, but another strategy. Okay, so we have to move through these fairly fast because I see we need to wrap up, but I wanted to just raise a couple of great questions. So for mobile advocacy, somebody stated that they'd noticed that through mobile advocacy, they were finding that clients weren't wanting to engage in supportive services while in the field. Wondered if there were any particular approaches that worked best. So meaning like in the field, I guess, when the advocate was out there meeting with folks in the community, that they were less likely to want to engage. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I would add, Emily, I would just encourage, I would encourage understanding what the specific fear is. You know, is it certain locations? Is it who will hear things? You know, some of the things that that Chris and Linda spoke to earlier. I know sometimes just walking, so it may not be, a specific place, but, the focus is on the engagement and the surroundings that make that person, the survivor, feel safe, whatever that may be. So thinking really creatively. And Chris, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sure you.
No, I think always remembering that it's the survivor's choice. And so in addition to what you said, Emily, about is it the place, is it the privacy issues, what is it about meeting out in the field that doesn't feel comfortable, or is it just something where the survivor prefers coming to your office and not having you in their space? So it might be that somebody's trying to communicate that that's really not an approach that they are feeling comfortable with, and just being transparent and having that conversation so that you can really suss that out. It's really important to know that it's not mandatory that you provide services in this way. It's an option.
So we're at the 4 o'clock mark, and we received so many questions that we weren't able to get to, particularly around the dynamics of a rapid rehousing program. And thankfully, we will be providing, the DVH-TAC consortium will be providing resources around DV rapid rehousing as part of the NOFA support, the HUD NOFA support that we'll be providing soon. So I would say please stay tuned for that information, and also please don't hesitate to reach out. Here's a list of some of our upcoming trainings, and that's apart from the HUD bonus project NOFA resources that we'll be providing. And you can always request technical assistance through the safehousingpartnerships.org website. So without further ado, thank you so much. And Jenny, did you want to add any closing remarks?
I just want to say thank you, Suzanne. The one training that's not in this upcoming trainings list is one that we have just added, which is a deep dive. We're going to be doing 2 different sessions of it on July 20th. So if you want to keep this conversation going, please go ahead and register for that. I put the registration link in the chat, but we'll also send it with your follow-up materials. And I'm just so impressed by everybody's great questions today. Thank you to our presenters and to the TA team for hosting it for us today. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thanks.
Everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.